Many wrestlers in the industry have charisma. It's almost a requirement, especially if you want to have a prominent position. This is a common theme in pro wrestling. However, every once in a while, a talent comes in that has the it factor that's so undeniable that even their detractors have to acknowledge it. Enzo Amore is the greatest example of this. The man, ever since he stepped foot in a WWE ring, had heat for the way he acted, but even then, they knew he was money, especially under the WWE umbrella. He was the most charismatic wrestler in NXT, and this was prime NXT, the WWE Network era where the show was in full sail. Amore always had the crowd under his thumb, and it came effortlessly. This guy was meant to be an entertainer. I don't know about pro wrestler because his matches weren't that interesting. He was very green, but because of his undeniable charisma, that was constantly overlooked. And for the most part, he always had some sort of storyline that didn't really revolve around wrestling. When he came to the main roster, his behavior was under a different kind of surveillance. 2016 was great for Enzo and Cass. The duo had a strong hold on Raw, and Enzo even outshined John Cena at one point. Think about that. He outshined John Cena in a segment. It was a short time, but something he'll always bring up in interviews because he was really a bright spot in the summer of 2016. Triple H, though, didn't trust the duo too much and straight up said that he didn't give them the NXT Tag Team Championships because they'd fuck it up. There wasn't much heat on Enzo throughout 2016, but when news came out after WrestleMania, it started becoming a common occurrence. This is the kind of heat wrestlers wouldn't have in the Attitude Era. It led to many different stories. He was kicked out of the locker room, brought some odd guests who recorded wrestlers, which isn't a common theme backstage. Cass was moved away from him. It reflected badly on Enzo because he had nobody by his side in the back. Roman Reigns was the one who kicked him off a bus once, and even though he was one of the best promos on Raw, probably the best, nothing was working. So they did something entirely different with Enzo Amore. They had him in the cruiserweight division. This was a good move because it gave the fans more of a reason to care about the division. They didn't have bad wrestlers, but it felt insignificant, which was a big difference from a year earlier where the Cruiserweight Classic succeeded. The Cruiserweight Classic to me was probably the very best thing the WWE put out in the summer of 2016. I was all for it, and it was a fresh new outlook on the Cruiserweight division, you know, because WWE hadn't done a Cruiserweight division in about, from that time period's perspective, 9 years. And this one was way more explosive and way more interesting than the Cruiserweight division was. And that mostly comes down to the freedom they had. You know, the wrestlers of old didn't have the freedom to hit certain moves. But the problem was at the time that even though the Cruiserweights were just simply great wrestlers and whatnot, there wasn't much invested in them. It was just them going out there, blah, blah, blah. And WWE didn't really care much. They hyped it up initially. I remember the first episode of 205 Live. It was very good. But like after that, there wasn't much of a reason to tune in. Like every once in a while you'd hear about some certain match that hit hard, but like there wasn't much of a reason to tune in. Enzo though was going to be a huge reason. Now at the time, WWE had made it known that he had heat in the back as well in their storylines. They also had him get trashed by The Miz. Miz was a villain, but he looked less of a heel here than Amore. He said nobody could stand him and that he ran to the Cruiserweight division because he had nowhere to go. The man doesn't think before he talks. He has to cheat to win in the Cruiserweight division because he doesn't know how to jump off the top rope. Miz called him a con artist with a couple of catchphrases. Great line, by the way. And as good of a promo Enzo was, he was unable to overcome this one with The Miz laying into him as if he was the heel. He said if Enzo was championship material, his best friend wouldn't have abandoned him. This was big. WWE was starting to acknowledge his backstage problems and at the same time was pushing it much harder with the Cruiserweights. He got a title shot against Neville at No Mercy. The champion made a mockery out of Amore's gimmick, to which Enzo called him jealous because he was the one that made 205 Live interesting. Enzo said he's twice the superstar that Neville is, and he's got everything going well. Doing commercials, selling merch, hanging out with Drake. I don't think Neville's interested in that. You strike him as a guy that'd be interested in hanging out with Drake? The charisma was shining off Amore. Half of the stuff was absolute nonsense you have to listen to again, but he makes it work. Hydrated in the haterade and showered with love is what he said. And he even called Neville the big fish in a small pond. And he's a shark that's infested Neville's water. The champion didn't care about merchandise sales and being a superstar. When the bell rings, none of that matters. What matters is Enzo being unable to wrestle. He proved himself right with a low blow to the champion ahead of No Mercy. This was seen as a cowardly move that seemed to highlight everything that Neville said. Enzo continued the insults at the event, calling him a Keebler elf looking schmuck, and the match was just there. It wasn't much because of how limited Amore was, but there was more effort into him. Still wasn't good though. It's hated. I actually searched it because I didn't watch WWE much at the time. I kept up with Enzo and stuff. But this match was actually hated. People did not like it, and they felt vindicated in the sense of Enzo being unable to fit the Cruiserweight division. This match was a prime example of that because Neville is doing very well here, especially as the king of the Cruiserweights, but even he was unable to get something out of Enzo Amore here. He brought in the title and used it to distract the ref and low blow Neville to win the title. This came from out of nowhere. This whole push brought more interest to the division, especially for Vince himself, because the next night, Enzo main evented Raw. Now just think about that. Look at the past SmackDown episodes in the past of the 2000s. How many times did the Cruiserweights actually main event a show? once. And Enzo, in his first night as Cruiserweight Champion, already did it because they saw so much in him, his character work, his promo work, and of course, most importantly, his charisma. He celebrated his title victory with many enemies watching on. He was well aware of the fact that many were waiting for him to fall and called them jealous. He also insulted Big Cass for saying he held him back. If anything, Enzo made mention of how he made 205 relevant, so a bunch of the guys came out and he was unaware of the show's theme song saying, "What's that horrible music?" They looked at him with envy, just like the people on Twitter when someone makes a proud tweet about themselves. He poked fun at Rich Swann's height as if he towers over the roster himself, which he clearly doesn't. He called Cedric the man charisma forgot. Grand Metalik, he's a fat ass, he ain't 205. Drew Gulak actually did something while wearing a suit, but then he made a slight remark towards him. He's making fun of them when Neville came out. The leader of 205 Live, at least was until No Mercy. Enzo said the title is on the shoulder of a real man. He called his ears satellite discs, and Enzo Amore was threatening the fabric of 205 Live, a show full of skill and honor. The two biggest elements that Enzo lacks. And Neville was watching on in horror, seeing this green egomaniac take everything they have built and throw it in the trash. Neville said that he wanted to leave Enzo in the cold, but they wanted to give him an opportunity. So he's like, I'm paying them back with being on their show because he's a star. The former champion wanted to take him out, but then Enzo said he had a note from Kurt Angle. So he continued poking fun at him, saying this is the final hour of Raw, the main event, something Neville never sniffed. He's money. Their merch checks combined can't touch his. Neville went against the rule and attacked Enzo. He made too many enemies that were all watching on in excitement. And Enzo acted like he was injured the next night on 205 Live, saying he tried to hide his injury like Cedric Alexander hides his charisma, but he couldn't. This was because Braun Strowman destroyed him after the show. The Cruiserweights then followed up with their moves, and Amore said he'll retire as champion and blamed Neville for all of this. He called him all kinds of things and told him that he's soft. The champion had very few friends, and his only ally was Arya Daivari, who lost to Neville in the main event. Enzo took advantage afterwards, using his crutch to attack Neville, and he had yet another main event segment on Raw the following week. Technically, because there was a Shield backstage segment that followed. This was basically the last outfield, I'd say, segment. He said that since everyone touched him, they can't challenge him for the title, and if they touch him, they'll get fired. He once again found himself in a tough situation. Unfortunately, he owned all of them, and the crowd couldn't really hate him. That's the problem here. Like, Enzo Amore is the heel, but how are you gonna hate this man when he has such sly and such tremendous one-liners that come from the back of his pocket? They just come out of nowhere. There's something unexpected yet hilarious. It's just hard to hate him. Kurt Angle came out and said because of last week, none of the wrestlers could challenge for the title or touch him, but there was an exception, Kalisto. He made his mark and became the next challenger for the title. Enzo said that Kalisto is going to become a draw now because he's on the Zoe show. His masks are finally going to sell, and he called him a centimeter and praised his skills, but also called him a loser. This guy's random. At the time, Enzo Amore was supposed to face Neville on the October 9th, 2017 episode of Raw. He was set to lose to the Certified G in a match, and he had enough. Neville had become the centerpiece of the 205 Live Cruiserweight division and had grown bored and uninterested with things. It was more of a way for him to develop and become a bigger player on the main roster, and it was a great run, but obviously it had to end. They just didn't know what they were going to do with him. He said in an interview in 2018, it wasn't really Enzo why I left. I don't hate the lad, he was just annoying backstage, and putting the title on him was bad, especially beating me. I was worth more than being jobbed out to jobbers. That's why I left. The part about him being annoying made me laugh more than it should have because everyone has the same opinion on Amore. I don't know why. Well, actually, I know why. Instead of Neville, it was Kalisto who challenged for the title, and it was a lumberjack match in the main event of Raw. This match was pretty entertaining because Amore made an enemy out of everyone and they wanted no part of him. Kalisto won the title here and Enzo quickly went after it. It was simply down to him thinking he's doing them a favor by taking over the division, and he was starting to get others by his side. He reclaimed the title at TLC, and it's a match you wouldn't bother watching. There's a reason why I didn't talk about it here, because it's like, he wasn't good in ring. It's like he maximized all his stats and charisma and promo and forgot to leave some for his wrestling, and he got himself disqualified in the rematch against Kalisto. The thing with Enzo at the time is, as entertaining as he was, because he was the Cruiserweight champion, it required a little more wrestling than usual. So every single time he'd go in there, he'd get exposed, and it'd be like, why'd you put the title on him? Then he'd cut a promo, it's like, oh, that's the reason why. So it was a constant circle, it's like, why? You understand why? Then you question it with the match he has next week. It was a circle that kept on going and going and going. I think he could have been a very good manager for somebody on the main roster, especially an upper mid-carder, but it's hard to work the dynamics out because he's very annoying and an upper mid-carder isn't exactly supposed to be treated like a joke. It's hard. So yeah. These matches are worth mentioning just for the result. Watching them, I never thought I could see Cruiserweight action so boring, unfortunately. I'm not trying to be blunt for the sake of it. It's just these matches weren't that interesting. Pete Dunne was a surprise opponent for Enzo on Raw in London and got squashed. Tyler Bate the next night got a little out of that main event match on 205 Live, and the reason why I say he got a little out of that is because it comes from that fighting spirit he brought. That's the thing with early days Tyler Bate. He still does it, obviously, but like early on, because he was so young and felt like such a huge underdog, he shined brighter. Enzo scored the win, but it was still Kalisto who was on his heels. They had a match set for Survivor Series for the Cruiserweight Championship. I just want to say the Drew Gulak and Enzo partnership was nice. They were funny, shared a lot of banter, and gave the main roster more of what Gulak had to offer, because on paper, he just seems like a generic wrestler. Yeah, he's skilled and whatnot, but he didn't have much to offer beyond that. On paper, keyword on paper, because if you were watching 205 Live at the time, which I wasn't, I was like watching it from time to time, he had more character work than you'd expect. The match at Survivor Series was just there. Kalisto shined, of course, but he could only do so much with Enzo. He was still leading the Cruiserweight division, but took the role of a kingpin with his few backup guys. As often as the Cruiserweight champion would wrestle, Enzo rarely did, especially compared to the previous champions Rich Swann and Neville. Instead, the story was centered around the Zoe train, which was basically a faction. The faces were going to go against him to take out the poison of 205 Live. Enzo Amore, he held himself to a much higher standard than his guys, and it seemed like Drew Gulak was going in on the title. He was set to face Rich Swann for an opportunity to challenge Enzo, but then a domestic violence issue happened with Swann, and that was the last we heard of him in WWE. If I had to guess, he probably was next in line for that title. At the same time, Nia Jax took a liking to Enzo Amore, and it felt natural to the champion because he's a winner, but it also seemed like you grew some fondness for Nia Jax. The Zoe train was starting to derail with the team not being on the same page. Drew thought there was a possibility of him winning the title, and Tony Nese, on the other hand, thought he overreacted, and Enzo felt so disrespected that he wanted a match. His ego was already bigger than Vince's pockets. For as big as Enzo's ego was, maybe that's too much, but being slightly challenged for something he said sent him off the deep end, leading to Tony Nese getting kicked out of the group. Drew Gulak felt a certain way about his friend being taken out for the stupidest reasons, and also seeing in clear view how much of the power Enzo had allowed to get in his head. They didn't pull the trigger yet for this one though. Same with Nia Jax. There was always something in the way. I think Nia was always going to turn face around this time. It's just what happened later on accelerated that. Enzo defended the title for the final time against Cedric Alexander on the January 8th, 2018 episode of Raw. It had an abrupt finish with Cedric winning by counter after Enzo hurt himself, which of course greatly upset Nia Jax, who went to check on him. The story with Nia was starting to get more and more interesting, but then something big happened. So as I mentioned earlier, Enzo had heat in the back. He wasn't liked because he was almost too confident and did some other things as mentioned earlier. This rubbed people the wrong way, and in turn there was plenty of rumblings. WWE even had an episode of a new show centered around Enzo and his heat around January of 2018. That wasn't the big story, so then Enzo had a allegation. This was huge and came from out of nowhere. The worst part in all this was the fact that he didn't tell WWE for 3 months. At least that's what the story was at the time. The story from the January 2018 perspective was that Enzo did not inform WWE of anything. They heard it from elsewhere, and it's important to mention that he won the Cruiserweight title 3 months earlier and had that whole story just beginning. It was a huge mistake that was costly because number one, an allegation like that one is one of the worst to have, so not telling WWE about it would make you look more suspicious. Not to mention from a company perspective, they allegedly employ someone that does that. This is the Me Too time period. This was when a lot of people were getting exposed, a lot of allegations were thrown at people, so it was a very strange time. We heard some allegations from Vince McMahon a couple of years later, and we saw how that turned out. The reason why I mention that is because Enzo isn't even a upper mid-carder or something, so they quickly suspended him. The Raw 25 episode was going to see Nia Jax save his title from the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase during a poker segment. That's the reason why there was a lot of poker segments throughout the show, and lead to a big moment a while later where Enzo ends up with Alexa Bliss. It wasn't going to end on the same episode. It was going to happen much later on. So now that he was suspended, that didn't happen, and instead Nia Jax caught Alexa making fun of him. It was never going to hit as hard as it would have with Enzo. The allegation was investigated and did end up being dropped due to a lack of evidence, and the worst part in all of this, apparently, the police report revealed the most important information in July 2018, and something that showed how unjust the world is. So Enzo got suspended. He didn't last too long, as only a couple of days later, WWE released him, and many believed it was because he didn't inform them of the allegation. But the report stated that he wasn't contacted, so he had no idea. And I do recall reading this a long time ago, but as I'm making this video, I didn't go with that assumption. Of course, because he was already a disliked name, that was it, he was done. Here's what he had to say in an interview back in 2018. So I go see Vince and he says, "We can't send you out there tonight. We can't put you on the show. This tweet, this is really bad." I didn't say anything. I just stood there and I let Vince talk for a minute, and I said, the first thing I said was, "You know, and I know that I didn't do this and I deserve better than this because I'm a good person." And I walked out. Vince said to me, "You gotta tell me when something like this is happening." As I'm walking down the hallway at the Barclays Center, McMahon told me, go home. I said to him, "I guess I'm on my way to DC. SmackDown is in DC. I'm like, "All right, you're sending me to DC?" He goes, "Go home and wait to hear from us, and we'll tell you if you need to come to SmackDown tomorrow." At that point, I had no idea that I was suspended or being fired, and the way it was kind of relayed to me, it was like, okay, I guess I'm going to DC tomorrow. tomorrow. I'm playing by ear, waiting to hear. I walk down the hallway and I see Adam Hopkins, and I'm like, is there any further information? Have you guys gathered any further information, like on a legal tip? He says blah blah, and then informs me that I've been suspended and the tweet already went out. I grabbed Carano, WWE Senior Director of Talent Relations, immediately. I saw him just by chance by something and I said, I'm never going to be able to forget this. I said, look at me right now, I'm out of here and I'm not going to forget this. I walked out with a lot of emotions. He was fired and the Cruiserweight Championship was vacated. Just like that. All the stories they told, the stuff they were building towards, it was gone like that. The only good thing to come from his release, which was unfortunate, especially because of how things went later on, was the fact that the Cruiserweights had a great tournament for the belt. It was the best thing from 205 Live up to that point. Drew Gulak's character wasn't the same, and Nia Jax continued on with a different storyline with Alexa Bliss. Enzo always had a red target on his back. If he was a much bigger wrestler, things would have gone differently for sure. It's like, why should we continue with this guy? He's annoying, doesn't listen, and now has a big allegation. Alright, with that said, what's my personal opinion on Enzo's Cruiserweight run? In ring, I didn't like it. It was bad. Like, straight up, I did not like his Cruiserweight run. I was actually working on this video a while later, but I stopped it because of how bored I was by his matches. Like, to be honest with you guys, he did a lot for the Cruiserweight division. On the other side, he brought a little more interest. Effortlessly, by the way, because the other wrestlers had to damn near kill themselves and destroy each other to have some interest in the 205 Live show, which again is a bit of a mistake. You know, the fact that WWE has an entire TV show dedicated to cruiserweights. It should have been a small thing on Raw or SmackDown, but it is what it is. As for Enzo, his promos were the very best on 205 Live, and that's exactly why they centered the show around him. It's because he was very charismatic, had a leading character trait about him, but I would have preferred to see him as a manager, because even though he was the champion and escaping and all that, and that's the story they were telling, that he's not a good wrestler, he was boring, because at the end of the day, he had to wrestle. If he was a manager or something like that, they would not have that problem at all. Like, yeah, he could wrestle occasionally or something, but they wouldn't have the problem with him leading the show as they did with 205 Live, which was already an uninteresting show to many. So to add Enzo in there was a way of, like, trying to bring more attention, which did work, but at the same time made it more boring, so it's like it kind of downgraded in some ways. But it is sad how things ended up. He ended up being released for that stuff. The charges were dropped. Lack of evidence, you know. Lack of evidence obviously doesn't mean innocent, but they didn't find anything. And that's more than enough for some people, I guess. I just didn't like his matches here. There wasn't many that were interesting in here. When I talked about matches in here that were decent, I mean decent for Enzo Amore level, obviously. They also had to sacrifice Neville, who I personally think was going to leave anyways, because he was burnt out, you know. Neville was actually like, he had enough. He had enough of the WWE at the time, so I highly doubt he would have stayed anyways, even if he didn't lose to Enzo, because the man was working very hard. Enzo called him the hardest working man in the entire company, so I think it was bound to end terribly, especially in this era of WWE. Like, Neville was not going to last. He was going to leave. So it did take away that, which was a good story. You know, Neville is the Cruiserweight champion. It was a wonderful stuff. But at the same time, I could see why Enzo was on the show, because he had a great character. He was very charismatic, obviously small. But I would have preferred to see him as a manager. I think that would have gone very well for somebody on the main roster. After release, Enzo actually left wrestling for about a year and a half. He wanted to be a rapper, and there was rumors at the time that he was going to leave WWE anyways to pursue that. I don't know why he wants to be a rapper, but judging by the time period 2017-18, I think he saw that meteoric rise a lot of artists had at the time, like Lil Pump, and maybe he saw an opportunity there. He even released a diss track towards WWE in June of 2018. It was during the Prime World Star era. Prime World Star, where they used to drop music videos and go crazy. He dropped a music video on there trashing the company, which obviously didn't help his case. And then a couple of months later was at Survivor Series in Los Angeles in the crowd, which was very, very embarrassing and something that I personally believe prevented him from returning to WWE. Alright, what you guys think of Enzo's Cruiserweight Championship reign? Please comment down below. And that's it for this video. Make sure you hit the close line on the like button and perhaps a splash on the subscribe button. Peace. I'm out.